Yeah, we're gonna start this stream out by putting up my Patreon on the chat. It's also in the bottom of the uh, description for those who are interested. And we're gonna get down to this. And I know I've gone before on the idea of replacing the replacing John Bolton for the National Security Advisor, and I believe it was a live stream on that. Actually, it should have been a live stream. Now we're going to go on the idea of replacing the State Department Secretary Pompeo with someone who understands the role of being a top diplomat. And this we're going to use as hypothetical being Jim Jatras because he actually understands the idea that you're being a diplomat. Now, we're going to be looking at a few different reasons why we're asserting this. And number one is basically when we're looking at the actual theory of what we're talking about from this, we need to understand is what our founders understood. And we're going to go back to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson basically understood that we should not have entangling alliances, and we should be promoting peace, commerce, and friendship with all nations. Now, if we look what our actual, not only of what our defense is doing, with what we're doing globally, but what we're actually doing with our actual State Department, we're going in the complete opposite direction. And that means Pompeo is not doing his job. We have people calling for actual intervention around the globe. This is not their job. Their job is not to criticize other nations and how they're being run and basically say, hey, we have sanctions on that country. You can't deal with them. That's not their job. Our job is not to put sanctions on countries. As it says right here, that I already stated specifically, promoting peace, commerce, and friendship with all nations. Promoting commerce would be the exact opposite of sanctions. Sanctions is the exact opposite of promoting commerce. That's trying to stop commerce. And any moron could realize that basically is what Pompeo and these other people who have done this, as basically the idea of sanctions would essentially be an act of war. It essentially is economic war, what you're actually doing. So what you're doing with that is that's economic war, and when you create essentially an alliance with certain nations, you're essentially doing this. You're essentially creating when you create an alliance with one nation, you're creating an entangling alliance because they're essentially going to say, we don't like these other nations. We're going to essentially say that you can't like these nations either, and we're going to drag you to go to war with them and restructure the world around our vision. This is what we see with Saudi Arabia, what we see with NATO, and what we see with Israel. And we see that basically is when it comes down to the things that Israel has stated, Pompeo buys into everything hook, line, and sinker. Now, it's not his job to essentially try to basically create tensions in anything. It's his job to diffuse them. He's essentially the top diplomat in the country. That's his sole job. And his job is not to create any tensions. His job is to ease these tensions so we do not go to war. That's the sole job of a diplomat. If you cannot do that job, you need to be replaced with someone who can. And it doesn't, if you don't want to do that job, go and leave and do something else. And this is why we have that position. This is meant as a position solely of diplomacy. And that's where we come from with it. Now, when we look at his ideas on foreign policy, we see he has a liberal foreign policy perspective. This means he believes in intervention and this is essentially going against the idea of promoting peace, commerce, and friendship with all nations, and not having entangling alliances. Again, against our founders' visions. Our founders believed in an identity perspective, which is believing in the actual idea that ideas change the world, and that if you want to impact the world, you impact them through ideas. This would be through diplomacy. That's the way you do it. You don't do it through force. Force is only going to make things worse. Such as what we're doing out in Venezuela. That's only making things worse, because it shows that he doesn't understand geopolitical matters, nor does any of the people such as the CIA nor the National Security Advisor. None of them understand what's going on geopolitically. If they would understand that basically we're taking one socialist and replacing it with another person who comes from a party that is socialist and progressive, which is basically going to give you the same party, but in that case, that party is violent. And basically what you're going to get is you're going to get anybody who disagrees with them is going to basically be slaughtered. And they're going to be killed because of the sole reason disagreeing. And that's not what you want. Which is why when we have Juan Guaido stating that the U.S. should reject socialism because of the horrors of it, well, that's quite humorous because he's a socialist himself, and he has no business making that assertion, because he's only doing that because he wants to appease the United States system to make it look like he's an actual capitalist when he's not. He is a socialist. He's just a violent socialist instead of one who basically acts upon the stimulus that actually comes to him, like Maduro does. Now, this is why we get to the point of Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo is a person who believes in these ideas of intervention. He can go into any country he wants and adjust it. And he believes this works. He's still unrepentant on his votes for the Iraq War. Now, the Iraq War is known to actually be a complete and utter failure. This was essentially, we took out a secular dictator and we basically decided to put in another government, and it based on essential intelligence that was deliberately known to be false to begin with. Now, this was essentially based on a whole big sack of lies that was put up by John Bolton, that was put up by Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu actually had an actual interest in it, as well as the Saudi government who he was aligned with. Now, this is a whole big thing where he basically wanted to ensure that he was going to get the Middle East carved up. Now, the Saudi government wanted to make sure that they were going to have this happen so that they can spread the Sunni influence across the whole region with Sunni radicals, which are basically what we call terrorists, or what we call now ISIS. Now, what ended up happening is you had the Shia countries essentially filled in the void to stop this, and you had them along with Russia kill these people, despite what you had the so-called coalition forces tried to aid ISIS to take over the region. And this is what we were doing. The so-called people that we were trying to aid, including what Mike Pompeo was trying to aid within the region, and his other buddies like John McCain. What all these people were trying to aid was essentially terrorists, and they essentially were telling Russia to back up because Russia was killing ISIS. And it was a mix of Russia and Syria, as well as Iran, were killing ISIS, and that was angering these neoconservatives. Now, this shows you that Mike Pompeo is not capable of running a diplomatic department. He also, when it comes down to the immigration question, he does not understand that, because he could be adjusting his actual policies. Now, his policy for what gets in. Now, his policies are basically adjusting based on for who actually gets in on these into our country is based on income earned in their home countries. Well, that's going to base on what the cost of living is in those current home countries, and that is a racist-based idea. And we know that basically that's going to benefit a lot of the countries in Europe. That's going to benefit countries like Saudi Arabia. That's going to benefit a lot of oil-producing countries as well. And it's going to benefit countries like such as Canada and Australia. Well, it's not going to benefit a lot of the and certain countries like Japan. It's not going to benefit a lot of other countries that actually have people who actually produce high numbers within the actual United States. Now, if we actually look at that, he actually is completely running it backwards. He's essentially letting people come to this country on immigration that could be very, very mediocre for the country when it comes to immigration for potential. He's essentially running immigration based on mediocre potential at best. And then when it comes down to the visas, he's also saying he's also keeping in a racist policy, which is basically saying this country has too many people getting married by U.S. citizens, so we're blocking them because of the amount of people getting married. He's continuing this racist policy. And this is another thing that needs to end. And he needs to understand that the idea of marriage should be considered as a free market system. And that basically it's not the actual people in the other countries that are the case, but yet the actual free market itself that's actually showing that these individuals have a much higher value than what the actual current individuals in our country have. And that's much of the attitude of the women in the Western world. And that we can go back to when I've discussed the idea of the ideas of toxic feminism. And that's why you're seeing these numbers go very, very high, and why you're seeing specific countries, and because they're more apt to have an even keel with their male counterparts, with the females. And that doesn't mean you get to be bigoted against them and say, hey, you have to choose from what women are within these countries, and we're going to block these other women from coming in because they're too young, and they're too young to come into our country. And we're going to basically do this off of a bigoted standpoint because we don't like them. And that's completely racist because of the actual standard. Because if they were from any other country that did not have a high amount of fiancé visas, you would essentially allow them into the country, and that shows basically it's solely out of racism. And you specifically do not want them in here because of the potential of them marrying someone. And when it comes down to it, you know, for them to marry someone, it has to be a two-way contract. It's a voluntary contract. And that shows that Mike Pompeo is completely, just like many other secretaries of state, completely clueless on how contracts work. A voluntary contract between two people works where both sides have to agree to something. That's what marriage is. Marriage is a voluntary contract between two parties. These people from these other countries aren't tricking guys into marrying them. I'm sorry, but that's not how this works. It's basically an even way of things happening. And when it comes down to these women, they have to have the finances to enter the country anyway, when it comes down to it. So if they had the finances to enter the country, this would mean that that if they were to enter the country visiting, and if they were to marry someone, this would mean that basically they're coming from a such as we're talking about the Philippines. This would mean that they're coming from what they would call a social class position. meaning middle income or high income individuals. Most likely, if you've rejected them, they're probably coming from middle income. These are people that are not exactly going to tie themselves down with any single man. They're going to look with one that they actually trust. They're going to be very, very selective, which is going to be a lot different than other people out there. And this is a lot different case with it. If he actually, when you actually do some studies into the way they react, it's a lot different than other countries. Then what actually happens with it, you're not going to find people actually doing this for the actual entering in. When it comes down to it, they're not really interested in that actual fact, because they actually do not want to essentially be tied down with just anybody. They want to make sure that they actually can trust them. There's actually a trust factor back and forth, that they can actually feel like an independent individual. And this is something that I think that our State Department doesn't understand, and it hasn't understood for a long time. Now, what we need to also understand, that what makes Pompeo completely illegitimate is that he doesn't understand when it comes down to how to pick on a preferential basis. You don't just do it on certain countries that are that make a higher income currently, because that doesn't equate out to necessarily having any potential within the United States. It could essentially lead to a lower potential or the same potential as is. You need to go with people who have essentially the highest potential earnings with the United States. This would be people who you look at the actual numbers what they earn. Now, you could see in certain cases countries that have earnings that are much lower in their country, but basically could be 20 times that amount when they reach the United States for their average earnings. And it doesn't mean that, hey, you go, hey, they're so low in their country with it, we're not going to accept them because their earnings are too low. No, it means that basically it means their cost of living is much lower, so they don't need to actually pay their people as high in their own country. So what we need to do is look at how much they make as an immigrant group when they actually come into the United States, and that's how we need to judge it. Because even if we were to raise the amount with it, we know that the number is not going to drop that heavily. And when we see the actual bottom five, we see Iraq, we see Somalia, we see Dominican Republic, we see Haiti, and then we see Mexico. Those are the bottom five. Now, when we see the top five, we see India, we see Australia, we see Taiwan, we see the Philippines, and we see England. And this is very, very key to the way we need to view it. And we can see that those are the people that you want in this country. Now, the people, now where you're going to find a lot of these European immigrants is they're pretty much smack right in the middle. And in many cases, they're making in our country less than they made in their home countries. And this means that their potential is at, if not less than, their home countries, which is why a lot of times they're not usually staying here, because they find that the actual potential to earn is not as great. But when you see like something like the Philippines, it's like they can make between 20 to 25 times of what they make in their home country. Those are people that definitely want to be here because their actual potential earnings is much higher. And this is when we get people like Pompeo that do not understand these things. And you need to look at these factors. These are the factors that matter. Then when you look at certain other factors, you need to look at basically all you need beyond that is what do they have for people entering the country. Is the individual, does the individual pass a background check? Make sure they actually have a legitimate background check. And this doesn't mean that, and this means the same thing with diplomats as well. They don't pay, if people of other countries do not pass the security, do not pass this background check, do not let them in. And if they have trouble with it, guess what? They don't come in. And it's real simple. And you should be very, very stiff with that, and be a very, very, very big stickler. And it comes to and then another thing with it is, don't keep spreading lies about other leaders. And this is another thing that they keep doing. They'll spread lies about other leaders and say they're tyrants and this other garbage. And they do this to the media as well. With it, this isn't just one media company. This is a lot of them. They use these media companies, and it's really not just. And we find this with multiple people who've been in the State Department from the heads, is they try to basically state that, oh, this guy is a tyrant and this guy is a murderer, and they do this, and they don't even understand the actual country. They've never been there. They'll basically make assertions about these countries without actually being there, and and then when it comes down to it, is when people have actually been there, they'll say those people are traitors for actually visiting those locations. And this is something that's very, very troubling. And I think this is something that needs to stop. And then when you criticize a leader with doing the actual criticize a person they want to put in power, they go, oh, you have to visit that country. Well, the fact is you've never actually understood the countries that you were trying to criticize the other leaders from to begin with, so you do not have the actual authority to actually do that point. And this is something that we find with them, is they live in a world of hypocrisy. And this is something that I think is a very, very troubling thing. They'll try to do this to validate their intervention. And if they'd actually look and see that our founding fathers never wanted intervention, you had Washington, who basically stated that he was against the any entangling alliances or any entangling affairs with Europe. And then when you had Jefferson, who basically, as I've stated, he did not want to have any entangling alliances and wanted us to basically promote peace, commerce, and friendship with all nations. It said nothing about having any having allies with any other country, and this was his basic sticking point that he was very, very insistent upon. This should be basically what you want. And when it comes down to probably the best diplomat in history of our country, it would probably be Thomas Jefferson. This is a person who knew about everything when it came to being a diplomat. And if you want to follow anything for how to be a diplomat, it would probably be Thomas Jefferson. So there would be no other within. And then you can't use the excuse of, oh, it's a different time. There's no different time when it comes to actually policy of being a diplomat. You need to understand that it doesn't matter what time in history you're talking. It's the policy is always going to be the same. You're just the leaders are going to change, but the policy will always be the same. And you got to understand, you're a diplomat, nothing more. Your idea is going to follow those ideas of promoting peace, commerce, and friendship with all nations. And you need to drop the idea of saying, oh, we need to stick by these countries. You don't need to stick by any country except your own. That's the only country that matters. And then your idea should be no entangling alliances. That's it. And it's really simple with it, and it's amazing that no one can figure this one out. That's actually been in this position. I mean, they all seem to gravitate for, oh, we need intervention. No, your job is a diplomat. And you should be basically trying to exert your power and fight with the... you should be fighting constantly with the Department of Defense. Basically, you need to make sure that they're not even used. You want to make sure the Department of Defense's budget is as close to zero as possible. Make sure that the Department of Defense has been rendered useless. when it comes to that. You want to basically assert that they're basically only acting in defense, and they're only basically functioning on U.S. And U.S. territory soil, because that's their only purpose. And you need to assert that because of your actual goals. And that's what we're not doing as a country. And this is where we come down to what we need to do. And when we see a diplomat that's telling us we need to invade these other countries, and even when he's making these statements saying, "Oh no, we didn't," making statements now, "Oh no, we didn't invade." We didn't try to sabotage the electrical grid of Venezuela. It was because their disarray of their normal system. And then when he did a few years ago, we had him basically state that he said, "Oh, we have to upgrade our electrical grid because we have to worry about a cyber attack from Russia on our electrical grid." Well, which one is it? Because we know the fact is, if he wouldn't have made a statement like that if he didn't think the U.S. was capable of doing such a thing. Because the fact is, that shows that he knows that the U.S. is definitely capable of doing it. Not necessarily that other countries are capable of doing it, but he knows that the U.S. is capable of doing it, and he wouldn't have made such a statement like that in the past if he doesn't think it's capable. If he doesn't think that the U.S. is capable of doing it, which means that, and then he was not exactly looking at the camera straight when he was saying it, and he was pretty nervous when he was stating it to begin with, when he was stating this to the camera, saying that the U.S. had nothing to do with it. And the U.S. did with it. We can definitely say that it could have been an actual physical attack by the opposition group, because we're not going to call him the acting president, Guaido, because that's completely illegitimate, because he was never elected. To be a president, you must be elected. This is just basic common sense. That's why that's why we're going with the idea of putting a person like Jim Jatras in, and we think that this would be a lot more functional for actually maintaining peace, because I think he understands that with the way things go, that if we're going to have the idea of public aid, we need to bring people in who are going to be the least likely to accept public aid. This means the people who, when they come here, are actually going to earn the most money. Makes the most sense. I mean, this is a logical approach. That's number one. Number two, we need a person that's going to be a diplomat. This means they're going to look at things to basically avoiding war at all costs. Number three is we need them to actually look at the ideals of our founders, not look at intervention. And number four with it is they're not going to basically come up with lies to basically assert the idea of the military intervention and try to demonize people to make them feel as subhuman. This is not the way you actually advocate for promoting peace, commerce, and friendship with all nations. And I think when we're talking about that, Jatras would represent that whole point, and he would start to break down the idea of these entangling alliances. And I think that's where we would actually be at when it comes down to that point, and get away from these ideas that have been troublesome. He represents something a lot closer to Jefferson than what Pompeo does. Pompeo is basically a bastardization of what the position should be, and as well as many other ones along the line have been, because they had this obsession with both Israel and Saudi Arabia and NATO that basically should never exist. And they don't even understand about anything about foreign policy and diplomacy to any such degree. I mean, they wouldn't understand anything above it. I mean, I could pretty much talk. If I could talk rings around them on foreign policy, there's something seriously wrong. And if I could basically make them start basically having an aneurysm because they don't understand what I'm talking about, because I know more than them, then there's to a great deal. And these are supposed to be the heads of the State Department, or heads of national security, or heads of CIA. This is a serious problem we have here, because these people are supposed to be the ones that are supposed to be best representing our nation. And if they can't do that, they need to step aside. Now, if you like this live stream with it, I'm sorry I'm cutting this short, but I'm probably going to focus on thinking about what I have to do for like future live streams and future podcasts, because tomorrow is going to be I'm just going to do a story of for my podcast is going to be a story of why I embrace liberty, and then I'm going to go from there and see what I can figure out to add on to things, and see where I can add to it, and so people can kind of get an idea of where we're at with this podcast, and I'll keep adding on a daily basis, because I'd like to add on to get an AM and PM live stream, and then try to get one podcast in as well. But this one, I don't want to kind of keep beating everything down with it. I want to keep a kind of simple idea of live stream, not kind of beat people down for a long time. So just basically share this around, make sure that people see it, get on social media. Definitely subscribe, click the notification bell, and check out my Patreon page. See if you can get anybody to check it out. And that's about it. And bye, everyone.